So let's go on to part two. I will just back up for 1 second here. Whoops. Let me just back up 1 second to just highlight a couple of the other chapters in the book. These are some of the kinds of questions that interpretive inquiry questions that we use to organize the different chapters. What makes a pioneer? What challenges did immigrants face? How did the environment shape history? And what makes a cowboy? So the cowboy question is the one I wanted to explore with you for part two. Cowboys are accessible kinds of figures and interesting figures, I think, both historically speaking and thinking a little bit about today, in fact. So again, I'm Todd Laugen from Metro State University of Denver History Department, and the interpretive question that I wanted to focus with you here: why do guys want to be cowboys? And we can broaden that a little bit later, but I wanted to just start with that at least as a kind of hook. And we have some cowboys pictured here. I'll just kind of take the cowboy, the most historic cowboy first, a guy named Buffalo Bill, William Cody, otherwise known as Buffalo Bill, with Lakota Chief Sitting Bull. And this picture is an interesting one, I think, to start with. We could just begin to ask, why are cowboys and Indians connected? How are they connected? What do we know about cowboys and Indians? That's the historic association, right, in American history. If you have cowboys, you probably have Indians. And so here we have a cowboy and an Indian, right? Buffalo Bill Cody, Lakota Chief Sitting Bull. There's an interesting story there that if we had time, we could explore, why this Lakota chief was a colleague of, briefly, Buffalo Bill. They were not enemies in this photograph. They were clearly working together. Buffalo Bill did these Wild West shows in which he paid Indians like Lakota Chief Sitting Bull to demonstrate what it was like to be an Indian. So this was at a time, again, that would fit with our earlier maps, thinking a little bit about, Colorado becoming a state, Western states like Montana, Utah. What's the story with Native peoples, right? And cowboys kind of factor a little bit into that kind of story. And thank you for briefly the comment too. I just want to quickly address a comment from Chaz. Thank you. Girls want to be cowboys too. And I want to go there. Absolutely. So thank you. I will get there. I promise. Up in the right corner, we have Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. We have historic cowboys here as well, although we don't usually think of them as cowboys in a way. They were political enemies, the leaders of two countries that did not get along, right, for at least 45 years during the Cold War, the leader of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union, or Russia. And here they are sitting together like buddies. So it raises an interesting question, this photograph. If you just wear a cowboy hat, can you befriend your enemies if you're hanging out at a ranch like these two gentlemen were at Ronald Reagan's ranch in California? And then in the lower right corner, we have a cowboy in the service of cigarettes. Cowboys are often connected with this particular brand of cigarette. The story of Marlboro cigarettes specifically is an interesting one because initially it was marketed by Philip Morris to women, and the filter had a little red line around it to hide lipstick smudges. But it wasn't selling well in the 30s and 40s. So after World War II, Philip Morris decided to embrace male icons or male images, working men of various occupations, in order to sell more cigarettes. They were thinking of using plumbers, sailors, other kinds of hardworking stiffs, but they ended up settling on the cowboy because that was the one that sold the most. They started with cowboy and really never stopped, right? So we have the interesting association here also of cowboys with cigarettes. And so you can see I'm beginning to at least suggest a conversation about cowboys and masculinity. We want to talk about femininity too, but there is an interesting kind of association between cowboys and masculinity that these different images can kind of help us begin to ask with students. I wanted to throw in just a couple of, one at least useful primary source, a memoir Little Britches by Ralph Moody. This was specifically about Colorado, but it really works in other states as well. I don't know if you all are familiar with this book. It was written in the 50s by Moody, reflecting back on his childhood growing up outside of Denver in a suburb, really where kind of Littleton is today, sort of southeastern suburb of what would be Denver. And it would be an interesting read aloud. It has an interesting chapter when this 9-year-old boy tries to be a cowboy, tries to keep track of his neighbor's cows, and has some misadventures that end well. But it's an interesting kind of tearjerker, honestly, story too. It's not exactly where the red fern grows, but it does have a kind of twist at the end that would have your students in tears if you were reading this book aloud. It's an interesting kind of primary source for thinking about cowboys. And then on the right, I have a page from the Sears Roebuck catalog from the Amazon of its day, advertising cowboy gear, specifically the Roy Rogers or the Double R brand cowboy suit, cowboy outfit, cowboy belt, cowboy boots, of course, and hat. This one has some personal significance for me. I had this belt and gun that I was given as a child growing up in Nebraska. I don't know why my parents were not cowboys or ranchers. We were kind of small city folk, and yet I must have wanted it. And I have a vivid memory of getting hit over the head with the belt, getting my first stitches because my neighbor Mikey Alling really wanted the belt and I wouldn't give it to him. Or he wanted it and I wouldn't give it to him. We were fighting over it, So anyway, this was sort of my misadventure into the world of cowboys. It kind of soured me a little bit on the world of cowboys, I confess, but it is an interesting kind of image and an idea that we would want young boys, potentially young girls, to look like and dress like and behave in some way like cowboys, right? What does that kind of mean to have that association? So some interesting visual imagery that we can begin to talk with students about here. So again, you're familiar with some of these themes and questions that I was highlighting. I see that my video screen is not stable, so I'm going to shut that down. But again, if you have chat or questions about this. So I wanted here to think a little bit about opening up the textbook again, thinking about issues thematically, and thinking about what it means to be cowboys. What is the work of ranching? What does that kind of look like? So one way we might think about cowboys is in terms of the jobs they did. And here's an example from a Colorado history textbook, a fourth grade textbook, that talks a little bit about cowboys. It talks about one of Denver's most famous cowboys, Colorado's really most famous cowboys, a guy named John Iliff. And the text, I'll just read it aloud quickly. He usually kept 10,000 to 15,000 cattle on his range. He paid $11 a head for them. He could sell them within 2 years for $30 a head. Cowboys worked for low wages. The grass was free. Thousands of cattle grazed on the unfenced plains. Cowboys from different ranches rounded up the cattle, right? So from the textbook again, just as an example here, we could think about an activity opening up the textbook, starting with a simple paragraph like this, and then trying to ask some questions and understand what interpretation is behind this, what's missing from this. This is about a job, right? Cowboy work, low wages, and we know there's a roundup activity, rounding up cattle outside. That is one of the activities that these cowboys seem to participate in, right? So we have a sense of cowboys from the kind of work that they do from this, but it doesn't tell us a lot about what that work was like. So I might suggest a text source to help us. This is from a novelist, actually, who's writing about what he understood cowboys did. He had some personal experience as well, but mostly he wrote stories. And here we have an interesting description of the kind of work that cowboys did and the fact that they first needed skill with a rope. And I have the word he highlighted here, which is important, right? We're talking so far only about men, which is a problem. And I want to introduce women at least in a minute. But he needed skill with a rope. His average workday was 14 hours from can see to can't see. And here we have a list of jobs, right? Rounding up branding cattle, gathering strays, riding fence, pulling cattle out of bogs, treating cuts, building, repairing fences, cleaning out water holes, whatever needed doing. Stories of the West are said, by those who don't read them, to be about cowboys and Indians. Actually, this is rarely the case. When the cowboy is the hero, he's usually a drifter and very rarely shown at work, doing what has to be done on a ranch. Cowboys were ranging in age from 15 to even as old as 80. They were a hardy breed. Their work was hard, brutal, and demanding. And we have a list of the kinds of jobs in this source, right? We have all those different things: rounding up, branding, gathering, riding, pulling, lots of active verbs going on here. So one question we might just pause to ask: why would anybody want to be a cowboy if it was low pay, hard, brutal, demanding? You had to sleep outside, often without a tent, in all weather, didn't have very good food, didn't get paid very much money. I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in. The romance, living the dream. Yes, you were your own man. Yes, all these associations that are not listed if we think about the job that a cowboy does, right? They're not necessarily connected. Even just, working outside has its appeal, right? Maybe better than working in a factory. But it is important to acknowledge, the fact that cowboy work was pretty tough work. It's not romantic if you think about a daily job, a daily life of a cowboy, right? So you all are suggesting some other important, more romantic cultural associations we have with being a cowboy. Riding a horse is part of the daily job, right? So yes, these are all really great examples that we could begin to think with our students about, right? What makes cowboys interesting or appealing? Maybe it was the only job available. That's true, although that doesn't account for the romance of it for sure, right? So yeah, thank you all for the interesting kind of comments. So I mentioned an important and influential Native American at the beginning, Lakota Chief Sitting Bull. This is a photo of a Native American, a Hopi from the Southwest, a Hopi boy herding horses and sheep across the sand dunes. This was from a really interesting collection of photographs by a guy named Edward Curtis, also in the Library of Congress. He took lots of photos of Native Americans. And if you're looking for some interesting and at least more respectful images of Native peoples, although they have their problems too, Edward Curtis is a good guy to look for. He has an extensive collection available on the Library of Congress's site, and you can look other places online too to find a lot of his photos. So this one dates from 1905, and it allows us to think for a second, could an Indian be a cowboy? Was this cowboy work? He was herding horses and sheep, so he wasn't herding cows, but the basic job of a cowboy, right, is taking care of, herding, keeping track of grazing animals like cows. Is there a really big difference if it's sheep? Is it a really big difference if it's a Native American doing the sheep herding, the shepherd work? Interesting questions, I think, and we could pose these possibilities for students. Just thinking a little bit about, is there something about the identity that is separate from just the work that's done? And you all obviously have suggested with your answers, yes, but it does allow us to ask that, kind of possible question as we're thinking about this work and why people would want to do this. Another important source for information about cowboys is the vaquero. So cowboy skills and cowboy vocabulary comes largely from the Spanish and Mexican settlers of what becomes the American Southwest, what is northern Mexico, right? And this is an interesting photograph that is available on display in Denver. If anyone's near Denver, you can see it at the American Museum of Western Art, across from the Brown Palace Hotel. You could bring your students in for a field trip. Quick little shout out to that museum. I have to say, they have an amazing collection. Philip Anschutz has made available now to public viewing this remarkable Western art collection. And field trips are free. If you want to bring students as young as third grade in, you can to do that. This is one of the photographs there by an immigrant artist, and an immigrant from Germany, no less, who decided to go paint cowboys and painted vaqueros as well. It's a really interesting painting. We could spend time with students asking a little bit about the details, but it captures energy in really interesting ways. And he's clearly trying to depict movement with a two-dimensional medium. So we could just ask, what do you see? What do the faces look like? Why is the lasso suspended in the air above the head of the vaquero, right? It's a really interesting set of images that we have going on here. But again, the important point for us to highlight, I think, is just that a lot of the vocab, a lot of the tools, and a lot of the skills that cowboys use came from vaqueros, came from people of Spanish and Mexican ancestry. And we don't often think about that as we use cowboy vocab, like the word lariat. We don't often identify that that really comes from the Spanish word la reata. So there are some interesting kind of connections and histories that we can kind of highlight here when we're talking about what makes a cowboy and where the cowboy's going to come from. So we have also the possibility of using art to talk about, again, some of the myths of cowboys, not the real life and daily work of cowboys, but some of the myths. And one artist that does cowboy myth better than a lot of others is a guy named Frederick Remington. We all, I'm sure, have problems with Frederick Remington's politics and his racist attitudes, but as an artist, he does represent the myth of the cowboy with remarkable power and potential. This painting from 1889 called Dash for the Timber, again, shows cowboys in movement. There's something about moving and riding horses that seems pretty essential to the cowboy. So it was not part of my Sears Roebuck experience with the cowboy. Maybe that's why I didn't like it very much. But we also see in the background, off to the right, some group of people. Any ideas who those people might be? Any speculation? They are kind of hard to make out in this one. I know yes, so probably Native Americans. Look like Native Americans. Yes, thank you. So your students would likely kind of come to that conclusion too, right? Could be a scene from a range war too, different bands of cowboys fighting over ranch turf, but most likely Remington was depicting Native Americans here in this. And he was good at capturing and beginning to create these myths, inventing really these ideas that cowboys fight with Indians. It turns out really it was the US Army that fought with Indians. And we could tell a little bit of a different story about that here. But it is important, I think, to begin to acknowledge how these myths are created and how they have a history that we want to kind of acknowledge and understand, if only to kind of unpack. Yeah, you all are highlighting some really interesting features of the photograph. The painting. I love using art like this with students because we can again get such interesting conversations going, even in small groups or as a whole class. And Mel is highlighting some really interesting aspects of color, how color features in this painting, and conveys certain meanings too. So we're thinking a little bit about cowboys as men so far, and I did promise we would talk about women as well. Could a woman be a cowboy? I think it was Chaz, if I'm not mistaken, was mentioning this. Obviously, the answer is yes, and women historically were also cowboys. This ain't just a recent thing, right? This photograph is really powerful, and it kind of makes me cringe a little bit for poor Bonnie McCarroll's head and neck. You can see her just as she's about to crash into the ground. She was thrown off of this Bronco. And the context for this, of course, is a rodeo. This is another place when we find cowboys, and another connection we have with cowboys, thinking about what is a rodeo? What does it mean to put skills on display, to entertain other people with these kinds of skills? And rodeos are still very popular entertainments. We were mentioning Cody, Wyoming, where Buffalo Bill Museum is located. They have rodeos every night going on up there, if you're curious. It's a fun place to visit and check out the museum as well as the rodeo action. Denver, of course, has the Western Stock Show every year, and we are famous for rodeos as well. But we have here the important phenomenon of a woman being a cowboy, right? So does that make her a cowgirl, perhaps? Does she behave and does she have the same kind of meaning as a male cowboy? Does it mean the same thing for a girl to be a cowboy as it does a man to be a cowboy? You know, a woman to be a cowboy? Does that have a different kind of association? Does that mean something else? This photograph, thanks Keith for the link. This is available from Denver Public Library. It's a useful one for thinking a little bit about, again, the skills of cowboys and what it means to be a cowboy. What is that kind of cultural association we have? Could African American men or women be cowboys? And we know historically the answer is obviously yes. Nate Love, and he went by Nate, although the spelling looks like Nat, wrote an autobiography published in, as you can see here, the early 20th century. He was a fascinating character, born in Tennessee as a slave, actually moved west soon after the Civil War, and describes a lot of his talents as a cowboy, one in which he says he lost all sense of fear and could soon, best all comers in riding, roping, and shooting, right? We have, again, those important skills that cowboys developed and become famous for. And something about those skills is appealing, is attractive, being able to do those successfully, effortlessly, gracefully. And we have Nate Love experiencing that. His is an interesting story, again, as an African American at a time of really intense racism in the United States, and what that meant to come west and try to be free of that racist worldview that was so important in the South and is also not trivial in the West, but is a slightly different, there's a slightly different set of opportunities, a slightly different set of attitudes in the West compared to the South. So we know that a range of characters could be cowboys. And of course, I can't finish without talking for a second about country music. What would we do without a cowboy hat if we wanted country musicians, especially the men, to separate themselves from other kinds of music in their visual appearance, right? Their stage presence. I would make a quick shout out here also to Ken Burns, the amazing documentarian who's produced so many famous documentaries about baseball and the Civil War. Recently, he did a country music documentary that is really valuable. And it's worth checking out to highlight the different diverse roots of country music. And we get a sense of that also in these photographs here, right? It's interesting even to think about Lil Nas, because he's come out as openly gay, right? He's announced that he's homosexual and gay, and a cowboy musician in a sense. Is there the cowboy image going on here as well in some way? He's trying to blend genres in really interesting ways, right? African-American hip hop and country music. A remarkable figure here when we're thinking about, again, what makes a cowboy? What does it mean to be a cowboy? My last image is from the Denver Art Museum specifically. It's a sculpture, and it may be a little hard to make it out, but if you're in Denver and you get a chance when the museum renovation is done, it's really worth checking it out. Artist Red Grooms created this piece called Shootout in 1982. And it has been controversial, this piece, because I think some Americans are uncomfortable with the depiction of the Native American figure in this sculpture. You can see it's basically cartoon cowboys and cartoon single cowboy, and Indian, represented in this sculpture. They're in a wagon that's hitched to nothing, and they're fighting at very close quarters over what looks like a pile of dirt. Not much of significance. So I find the piece interesting, though, even though it has been controversial, because it again raises some really interesting questions. And the basic question, is it okay to poke fun at the myth of cowboys and Indians? Or is that disrespectful to do? I think he meant it as funny. He meant it as a satire, really, a way that we might think about this myth as nothing more than that, not to trivialize the depredations and the attacks and the displacement and in some ways the genocidal campaigns against Native peoples, but to acknowledge that this connection we have with cowboys and Indians is often mythical, is often invented. And there's any range of Hollywood films that have done this with, in some ways, much more detail than Red Grooms, but it's a really interesting work of art. And I personally find that students are pretty engaged by this. You can get photographs of it from different kinds of angles too, than I have here. So that is my last slide. And if we had time for thinking about, and we do have some time for thinking about how to teach this, you can kind of see that I'm leading us here in more of a cultural history direction, thinking about the meaning of the cowboy, the gendering of the cowboy, how the skills, the work of a cowboy often gets separated from the image of the cowboy. So I would invite students here to think a little bit about this from, again, different perspectives, thinking about what does it mean for a woman to do the work of the cowboy? What does it mean for a Native American or an African American to do work that seems like cowboy work? How much would those people embrace the identity of the cowboy? And how much would they just be doing kind of the skills or the tools or the work that is important for cowboys? So it seemed to be another way that we might teach kind of visual literacy, use images again. We could pull in text like I did with the Louis L'Amour excerpt and the fourth grade Colorado history textbook. But again, the hope there was to kind of open up the textbook and use the visual sources to complement and compare with the text kinds of sources. So that was my hope with that. So I don't know if anyone has questions at this point or other ideas for how you might want to teach something like this. I would welcome your suggestions. So let's see, where are things placed? How might you have curated it differently? What is included, what is not included? Yeah, these are also really great kinds of questions for thinking about museums. Adding drama, like a tableau, yeah, I mean, I could see different kinds of presentation opportunities for sources like this that students might be able to practice this kind of curating, practice this sort of displaying in a way that suggests an interpretation, right? That allows them to create an interpretation. And of course, we can connect with the present day, right? Thank you, Carrie, for that, right? There are obviously working cowboys today. This is an important occupation for a lot of folks. Wax Museum. Yes. Question from Sarah about a hard copy of the book. There is a way to download a PDF of the book. So you could download the PDF and print it if you wanted. Currently, it's not available for hard copy or paperback publication, purchase, but it is available as a PDF file, and you can follow the link that I provided on the first page of the website, coloradohistorydetectives.pressbooks.com. You can download a PDF version of that. So Colorado history for the first time next year. Any favorite resources that I didn't mention? Yes, I love telling stories about William Bent and Owl Woman, the famous William Bent who created the Bent's Fort, and his Native American wife and their biracial children who grow up both Cheyenne and Anglo or white. They are really interesting. There's a lot of really cool stuff about them. Sadly, not enough about Owl Woman. It's all from George Bent, the son, and William Bent's perspective, but that's useful also. Yeah, also thanks, Kyle. There are a bunch of resources for teaching Colorado history available on the Colorado Department of Education's website. Kyle and I work together with a number of other really talented teachers, including Michelle, I believe, Michelle Pearson. Shout out to you. And Keith, I think. The Colorado Department of Ed, you can search for primary source sets. And those are organized in a similar fashion to what I've demonstrated today with my friend Meg and I. So that would be another good place to check out. And Kyle is providing the link here for everybody. You can kind of see that there. So yes, thank you for the good questions and suggestions. And of course, yes, the TPS network is another obvious place to check out. Yes, thank you. Good point. Thank you. Oh, and Colorado Experience. Yes, the videos. Thank you, Michelle. Yes, there are more than 50 videos about Colorado history, but they're also Western history. There's one I watched recently about Western water, Western power. That was really powerful and very well done. There's some on the Chicano movement. So yeah, Colorado Experience videos. Those are available for free download, free streaming on the Rocky Mountain PBS. Yes. So thank you all very much for taking part and for participating in this session. And I just want to wrap up again with a quick reminder about the link that you need to get your professional development certificates. And again, for future resources, and Keith is providing a PD certificate link also in the group chat. So please check that out as well. If you haven't been following the group chat, it's a good place. Lots of great resources. Thank you all for streaming and jumping in with all of those great resources along the way. Some really good stuff out there for doing Western history, Colorado history in elementary school as well as middle school. Sadly, it gets neglected. So if I can be helpful at all, please let me know. If you get a chance to use Colorado History Detectives, please shoot me an email. I would love to know how it worked for you. If you have suggestions for how we might improve it or use it in other kinds of resources in other ways. We're thinking about doing a kind of second edition, no, not second edition, volume 2 really, with some other kinds of questions and other Western history resources. So thank you all very much for attending. It's been a pleasure chatting with you all remotely, at least a little bit, although I'm really sorry I couldn't hear your voices and we couldn't have a conversation together. Maybe some other day.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks,
and again,
Kyle.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Keith Patterson and Crystal Payne for managing the chat room, and of course the Library of Congress for making these webinars possible through the TPS Teaching with Primary Sources program. As a reminder, again, there's the bit.ly link, bit.ly/PS Teaching Online, and all these resources as well. This webinar will be shared on the TPS Teachers Network on our YouTube channel as well. The next week's schedule will be coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. And thank you all once again, and have a great night.
Yes.